Past the throttle body is the intake manifold, and this is this big piece of cast aluminum past the throttle body. And it's important to keep in mind that everything past the throttle body is usually a strong vacuum. You can hear this if you run the engine without the air intake on. You can hear the engine just gasping at idle as it's trying to pull in sufficient air. This is just the way that gasoline engines work. In the case of this intake manifold, there's nothing actually inside of here. It's just a large feeder where the air spreads out after the throttle body. There's be a lot of turbulences in there, and it goes out, widens out into separate channels, and then makes a turn right here and goes back underneath. And then back here, at this point, it's been split into 6 separate channels, one for each of the cylinders, and it goes down into the next stage where the fuel is added by the fuel injectors. Because these the engines run gasoline engines run such a strong vacuum, we end up using this vacuum for things like brakes and four-wheel drive mechanisms and so on. So we'll talk about that in the next video. The problem with this strong vacuum in a gasoline engine is it makes it very vulnerable to vacuum leaks. And a vacuum leak essentially is a source of air that the computer doesn't know about, that the fuel injection computer doesn't know about, because it's measuring the amount of air that is going into the engine, partly through the mass airflow sensor, partly through our throttle body, our throttle position sensor. And then once it gets in here, if there's extra air leaking in, then the engine will be getting more air than it's used to, and it will try to compensate for this by adding a little more fuel, but it's only allowed to make so much adjustment for that. So if you have a major vacuum leak on the intake manifold side of this, then the car will never run smoothly. And any one of these legitimate uses of vacuum can be a source of a leak. Also, where this vacuum manifold bolts down to the fuel rail below, that's also very easy to have a leak because that's such a large bolting surface down below. So if you do suspect that you have a vacuum leak, it can be fairly easy to test for by getting something that's flammable, like propane, just a propane torch that's not running, obviously, can do it, or spray some carb cleaner. And you spray carb cleaner around while the engine is at idle. And you may have to spray in the back here. You can hunt around the throttle body right here. And if you notice that you spray and the engine RPM increases immediately after, then you found your vacuum leak, and you found that basically this fuel is now sneaking into the air going into the engine. It's being burned, and the engine is developing more power as a result. So that is how you can hunt down a vacuum leak in your intake manifold. The intake manifold makes service on this engine challenging for spark plugs, spark plug wires, valve covers, anything under the valve covers like the rocker arms, because it sits right on top of the whole top of the engine. And in order to get to anything underneath of it, you'll have to unbolt this. And it's quite intimidating the first time you do it, but therapy will help, I'm sure. Basically, once you've removed all the hoses, and there are plenty, then we have a line of bolts along this side of the intake manifold back here. And there's a line of bolts down the middle. But it's not so bad. Another comment I would make, the first time that I took out the intake manifold, I assumed that it would be necessary to remove the windshield wiper motor. It turns out that it is not.